Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much. I'm glad you're with me. We have got an absolutely hot show today, I promise you that. We'll be going to Washington, D.C. Ed McAteer is going to be joining us live from Washington. He's got a guest with him who's written a book that's going to get you all stirred up. Then here with us, Phyllis Schlafly, the lady who single-handedly stopped ERA. At least that's what a lot of people are saying about her. This woman is very upset about the courts. She says the courts are all messed up, and she wants to tell us how to get them right. This ought to be good. Stay there. I'll be right back. It is very seldom that only one person has such a great, significant influence in doing something political in this country. But a lot of people are saying that Phyllis Schlafly, in a very real way, though there are literally thousands and thousands and thousands of women, of course, who've helped her and men who've helped her, this woman was the motivating force behind stopping the ERA. In fact, the ERA was running along just fine. Many states were voting it through. All of a sudden it came to Illinois, and Phyllis Schlafly got very, very upset, and out of that has become a lot of political involvement. And I want you to meet my guest, Phyllis Schlafly, right now. Would you welcome her, please?
Thank you.
Glad you're here.
Thank you.
Before, and I want to really talk about judicial reform, and we're going to go to Washington. Ed McAteer's there, along with Pat McGuinness. Do you know McGuinness, who wrote the book?
Yes, McGuigan. Mm-hmm.
Blueprint for Judicial Reform. Anyway,
it's a very fine book.
It is a super book. I was amazed with it. Tell us about ERA, though. Oklahoma, you're doing the show live here. Of course, we're going all across the country. But
well, Oklahoma.
Donahue was here the other day, and he was touring his little groups around, and they were really pushing hard for ERA. Is it really dead?
Yes, it is dead, but we have to keep pushing the cadaver back in the coffin, and we will, because there are no arguments for it.
You're not in the least bit concerned that it's going to pass? You think the fight
Well, we're going to do everything that's necessary to put the last nail in the coffin, but you see, they don't have any arguments. And I think that
prejudice group over here today.
I think that the Supreme Court case, which upheld our right to exempt all women from the military draft under the present Constitution, has really helped a whole lot, because we know that if we had ERA, women would have to be treated just like men.
You mean you think that was something that
well, that's one good thing the Supreme Court did.
Catalyst. That may be the last nice thing she says today after you read some of this stuff. Is this, in your fight against ERA, is that what got you so upset about the courts, or has this been an ongoing thing for some while? Or?
Well, I've been interested and concerned about a lot of issues, but if ERA were in the Constitution, it would give such a tremendous weapon to the federal government, to the Congress, to the bureaucracy, and to the federal courts, that it could change our whole political, social structure in this country.
What initially got you going, Phyllis? I mean, when you saw ERA, I heard a little ad the other day on the radio. It was a little song, and it said 7 words that could not be more American, and they started singing the Equal Rights Amendment. They put it to music, and it was all being sung. And you know, when you first hear that thing, you think, now what in the world could be wrong with a nice little thing like that?
Yeah, well, they did a little piece of bypass surgery and forgot to include Section 2 in that jingle. And it's Section 2 that gives the tremendous power to the federal politicians, the bureaucrats, and the judges. And your imagination is not vivid enough to think up all the uses to which they would put ERA if they had it. Now, for example, there are prominent ERA lawyers who have called for all sorts of uses to which Section 2 and ERA can be put. They want federal control. They want court control over a lot of new areas, like family law, like all kinds of areas. And that's a major reason why we don't want ERA.
So was it Part 2 that really upset you?
Part 2, and then, of course, Part 1, which would require the drafting of women and putting them in military combat. We know that now, and they don't deny it.
When you talk about the courts, when we get to the courts and you begin to, because you are really upset about the courts.
Well, the courts are the cause of lots of the problems. We had quite a national election last November, a year ago, and we made some great changes in the executive branch and in the legislative branch. But it's the judicial branch that has caused so many of the problems our people are concerned about, such as forced busing in the schools, the elimination of voluntary prayer from the schools, the matter of crime, the whole area of pornography, the area of abortions. These are all problems created by the courts.
And you're saying, if I understand exactly what you're saying in your material, you're saying that the people, if they got their way, they would not be for these things, but then the federal judiciaries come along and they have just said, okay, this is the way it's going to be anyway.
That's right, and they're in there for life.
No one can vote them out or
Nobody can vote them out. And although this country voted out the people who were in the executive and legislative branch in November of 1980, President Carter appointed 35% of the federal judges now sitting today. They've got life tenure. They can be handing down the Carter decisions for the next 30 years.
Mm-hmm. I'm quoting out of Newsweek, because I'm sure you've heard this little thing out of the Boston debacle up there, and it says, Boston is a city increasingly run not by its elected officials, but by appointed judges.
That's right. The judges in Boston simply took over the schools. Now, courts have got a lot of functions, but they're not supposed to be running the school systems of this country. And even Attorney General Smith has pointed this out. The courts have simply decided they are going to run the schools. They are going to run the prisons. They're going to run the housing projects. They are going to control employment and so forth. And that is not the proper function of the judiciary.
But Phyllis, what about the other side? I mean, if the court doesn't move in and we have school boards who set up totally segregated systems and they're not giving equal education to people and they're allowing the prisons to be totally overcrowded, 4 or 5 people to a cell, I mean, who is going to safeguard the whole human
well, the United
rights?
States Constitution says that all legislative power is in the Congress. It didn't give any of it to the courts. The function of the court is not to substitute its wisdom for the legislature. The function of the court should only be to knock out a law that is clearly unconstitutional. But that's not what the courts have been doing. They create these new rights. Now take the matter of pornography. The Supreme Court is the major reason for the flood of pornography we have on the newsstands today. In decisions, in a series of 36 decisions in 1966, 67, and 68, the Supreme Court overturned lower court convictions, and they simply unleashed all this pornography. And the new rights for smut peddlers and no rights for people who want to maintain a decent civilized society. And they had no business doing that. And the people don't have any recourse against Supreme Court judges because they're in there for life.
A lot to talk about, which we will today. Please stay there. I'll be right back.
Steve Sill, sales manager, his wife Karen.
Carrie and I joined the Winter Circle for one primary reason, to support Richard Hogue. We believe that he is the greatest communicator of God's Word in America today. From the day we made our financial commitment to Richard's ministry, God has just blessed us immeasurably.
Great. It's really so wonderful to have such an active role in a ministry that's reaching so many people.
Join the Winter Circle. Call or write Richard Hogue today.
Bill, I would like to go to Washington, D.C. and see my old friend Ed McAteer, who's supposed to be out there someplace. Edwin, how are you doing?
Wonderful, Richard.
It's good.
Greetings from the most exciting piece of real estate in the world, Washington, D.C.
Thank you very much, my friend. Would you introduce that handsome young man sitting to your right?
Yes, this is Pat McQuilkin.
You can't say it either, Fred. It's McQuiggan.
It's a hard name to pronounce.
I've been studying here. Phyllis has been helping me pronounce this. You know, with Schlafly and McGuigan, we get these German and Irish together. We're going to have us a real fight on our hands today, I think.
That's real coalition, Richard.
No question about it.
Yeah.
Pat, when you wrote... very, very good, Ed. When you wrote the book Blueprint for Judicial Reform, what were you so upset about? What got you to do this?
Well, to tell you the truth, right after the election of 1980, the man I worked for, Paul Wyrick, called me into his office and said, Pat, we're real concerned because we've managed, conservatives that is, have managed to make some real good gains in both the legislative and executive branches, but the one area that's still dominated by the left is the judiciary. So what he asked me to do, and I got together with a friend of mine on Capitol Hill, Randy Rader, who works for the Senate Subcommittee on the Constitution, and we drew up an outline of the problems that exist in the federal judiciary today. And then we started from there and started calling renowned scholars, people we respected, members of the Senate, and asking them to get involved and take part and discuss specific areas that needed to be reformed in the judiciary. And that's how this book resulted.
Pat, you've
24 authors and 22 chapters.
You've got some of the leading men in our country have written in this book, and ladies have written in this book. Are you finding that broad a support for the idea of judicial reform?
Oh yes, it's unbelievable. If you look, the last chapter in the book talks a little bit about popular perceptions of the judiciary and the way that the public views the whole problem of judicial reform. We found remarkable support for things that even I consider maybe a little dramatic in terms of judicial reform, such as people are endorsing the whole idea of directly reconfirming federal judges every few years. As you know, the way it is now, judges have lifetime tenure, federal judges that is. But there in Oklahoma,
we vote.
Judges are appointed, we vote yes or no on whether or not to keep them. Some people seem to think that's an awfully good idea for federal judges. That's one of the ideas in our book, and we find that in the public opinion surveys there's support for this that exceeds 60–70%. It's unbelievable.
Ed, when you think about this whole idea of judicial reform and some of the things that the courts have done, can you tell me some specific things that have happened that cause people to be so upset?
Yes, well, first, generally, Richard, the courts, without a question, have played a major role in the shift of the biblically oriented values of our country to a humanistic value. For instance, few people realize that one of the reasons that slavery toward our nation for so long was that the Supreme Court made a ruling that black people were not human beings. Now, it's very interesting in the problem that we have before us today in the country, that of abortion, that this same tribunal, not the actual men, but I'm talking about the institution, has made a similar decision that preborn babies are not human beings. And one of the things that we have to realize that our founding fathers had the wisdom to put together a judicial, a legislative, and an executive branch of government. And we see, as Phyllis has already mentioned, the fact that there are so many things being fostered upon the people today that's not only contrary to the good of the person individually, but it's destructive to our nation. For instance, the slaughter of the innocents.
Well,
the busing of our...
Ed, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
In the matter of abortion, regardless of whether you might be for or against abortion, what we had in that case was the Supreme Court creating a new alleged right and looking around in the shadows, they call it the penumbra of the 14th Amendment, and seeing something that nobody else had seen for 100 years. Now, nobody who voted for the 14th Amendment thought it had anything to do with abortion. And this is a beautiful example of new law, new right created by the Supreme Court. Now, regardless of what your view is on abortion, it was not up to the court to invent something.
That. That's what you're saying.
Yes, they invented something.
Without getting... Go ahead, Ed.
One of the real benefits, Richard, of what we're doing today is, as it were, informing people that they do have a right. In other words, there's only one organic court that our Constitution created. That's the Supreme Court. All other courts up to the Supreme Court are established by an edict of Congress. Their powers are limited.
And so Congress could abolish them tomorrow.
That's right. They can abolish them.
Everyone except the Supreme Court.
Except this, and they can limit what the Supreme Court does now.
That would be judicial reform, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Well, listen, in view of the fact that we have a lot of the problems we have in the country today, it wouldn't be an idea, Richard. Let me say this, that we have over 700 federal judges in this country, and an alarming thing is that during the Carter administration that 152 of those judges were appointed to a lifetime tenure, and a survey shows that the majority of those people do not accept the biblical view of absolutes. Now, that's a sobering thing when we consider.
Indeed it is. Let me ask you and Pat the same question I asked Phyllis a while ago. If the courts do not step in, for instance, I'm looking at this Newsweek article about the Boston situation where the school board was not willing to refuse to enforce his desegregation order, and so the judge moves in and takes over the schools.
Well, now wait a minute, Richard. Let's not use the semantics.
Well,
let's call it what it really is.
Okay, what
it's
is it?
Forced busing.
Okay,
it's
they
forced
won't
busing. Now, there's
bus,
nothing in
and the courts think they ought to force. But what I'm saying is this, guys: who is going to be the safeguard?
Yeah.
I mean, who's going to
but
say, Phyllis,
who has
that
the
these little
colossal
black kids
impertinence?
ought to get to go to school where they get the same education that the white kids do?
Well,
No,
but
I
what
can-
kind
I
of
can talk
Do you
about that
understand
a
what I'm
little bit.
saying?
impertinence is it that some court should say that these black kids must be bused an hour and a half across town to some other school?
I know, but
there's
I mean,
no
if
proof
that
it's
is
a
the
better
only
school.
solution to it, what I'm saying is, whatever the solution is, I mean, who is going to? There's got to be someone. It looks like to me in
there's
society.
no
there's got to
evidence
be-
that helps black kids or that black
Well,
kids want.
I didn't want to get into the issue of forced busing. What I'd like to talk about is this: who is going to determine? Who's going to be the safeguard in society? Who's going
I
to
can
make
talk
sure
about that.
that
The
my
legislature.
rights?
The legislature.
Richard, I'd like to address that
Go
a little
ahead,
bit if I
Pat.
could. Well, if you'll go back in history and look in 1896, the Supreme Court, with the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, was the organization that they decided that it was okay in public facilities to separate the races. In other words, they took and completely ignored the 14th, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. Then in 1954, in the Brown decision, the Supreme Court reversed Plessy versus Ferguson and said, hey, we've been wrong for the last 60 years, we're sorry. They made what was in essence a good decision that the Constitution should be colorblind. They used some sociological and psychological evidence that wasn't really apropos, because what matters is what the Constitution says. But at any rate, then they took the 1954 Brown decision, and in the 1960s, Phyllis could talk about some of the details on this, they began to turn Brown on its head and said, no, you have to take race into account so that at the public schools you have a certain set percentage. And they started going around and taking race into account in order to reach these percentages, doing all this in order to bus kids across town, which
Pat,
is what they had been
Pat,
doing back in the 1950s
Yeah,
in
let me
segregated
say this.
schools.
I'm really not asking a question of segregation or integration or any of those questions. I'm not asking a question of pro-abortion or anti-abortion. I'm not asking those questions. I'm saying, in the structure, in the governmental structure as it is today, who is going to safeguard things? Who is going to make sure that we want the rights of the unborn protected?
Sure.
Okay, who's going to protect the rights of the
legislature,
unborn?
and the
The
legislatures
yeah.
have done a good job of protecting
That's
those
right.
rights until
Really
the
right
Supreme
there.
Court injected itself and created something new that was not within their proper right to do.
Would
Richard,
you- yeah.
what she's saying is very important for this reason. First of all, the structure of our Constitution said that the Congress would be the one that would develop legislation, and that the Supreme Court or the courts would interpret, not make law. Now, the reason that's very, very important is that the people express their will and their views there. And since congressmen are responsible to them, then their views then are being projected when the legislature fulfills its proper function, making laws, then having the court to interpret them. It's a mentality, it's a mindset that we have to understand that the Supreme Court is definitely, or any court, any federal court, is to interpret law and not to make law.
Yeah.
We've seen these things happen just the other way. We see them making laws instead of interpreting laws.
I've got to break. We'll keep this fight going when we come back, so you stay there.
A Woman's Touch with Marilyn Hogue.
Do you enjoy football? Well, boy, I'm the only woman in this family, and I've had to learn to. The thing I love the most, though, is the excitement of the big band and the neat formations they make. Some of them are just incredible. I don't know who puts that all together, but it always amazes me how each little marcher fits together in the bigger whole, and they come up with some real masterpieces. But you know, if you're down at the concession stand during that time, it's just all noise and confusion, and you're at the eye level of the marchers, and you look out there on the field, and it just looks like chaos. You have to be high up in the bleachers to really appreciate the beauty of the formation and understand it clearly. And that's the way it is with us. I'm convinced that if we could just get God's perspective on our lives, if we could really have the mind of Christ in us, the way Scripture talks about, so that we see things from His point of view, have our Father's eyes, that all the chaos and confusion of our lives would be transformed into a thing of beauty. each piece neatly fitted into place to achieve a magnificent whole.
Let me read you a little something that came out of the, is this the Sinlinger? Is that the way you say that?
I think so.
Sinlinger public survey, all right, public opinion survey. Listen to this. 68% of Americans want federal judges to run for election. 68%. It's incredible. 74% believe federal judges should be reconfirmed periodically. 81%, that is a tremendous number, 81% favor congressional efforts to withdraw jurisdiction from federal courts over cases involving issues such as busing. There's a movement right now in Congress to take the jurisdiction away from the courts to say they can't have anything to do with that.
Yes, and
abortion,
it's a good movement, Richard, and it's a device that has been frequently used by the liberals in cases when they didn't trust the courts.
I guess the first one was
such
during
as
the labor thing,
the
right?
Norris-LaGuardia Act,
Right.
the Hiram-Johnson Act, the Price Control Act. The liberals said, we don't trust the federal courts, we're not going to let them decide these cases. Now we're talking about areas where, frankly, we don't trust the courts, such as busing, prayer in the schools, pornography, crime, and so forth. And we should withdraw jurisdiction from the federal courts. And the Founding Fathers, in their wisdom, gave us this wonderful balance. And the Constitution is the most beautiful document which has these interlacing checks and balances, so that when one branch gets too strong, the other one can come along and clip its wings. And that's the power that Congress has in Article 3, and it should use it.
You ready for the wings to be clipped?
Absolutely. It ought to be clipped because they've gotten out of line. Now, you asked the question, who's going to protect these rights? Take the area of pornography. The question of what is obscene. Now, that can be very well decided by local juries. It doesn't take a lawyer with a graduate of some law school to decide what's obscene. Anybody can decide that. It was decided in many cases by local juries. The Supreme Court came along and said, we're going to reread all this obscenity and make a new decision and overturn the local juries. That wasn't their job, but that's what they did. They turned all the smut peddlers loose, and that's why we have all this filth in our communities. And that area was very well protected by local juries.
I'm for that, Phyllis. I'm for the local school board running the schools.
Right.
I'm for the local city government running the city. I'm for the state government. I'm for that 100%. My question is this: when the school board that's elected out here, and sometimes by 4% of the people who go to the polls to vote, when those people decide that they're going to do things and build schools that don't give equal education, that do put down one kid because of a race or a creed or something.
I'll accept that the Supreme Court could take care of that in Brown versus Board of Education.
Sure.
But then the courts took off into Wild Blue Yonder and said, not only that, we're going to run the school board.
Yeah, now, I agree. I think that's too much. I think they need to say, look, this is the law, you got to abide by the law.
So what we're
and go do it.
talking about is not getting rid of the courts, but cutting back their abuse of power, and they ought to be cut back.
Yeah, it's
agree.
very clear. You know, I don't want to harp on the issue of busing, but it's very clear that the court, beginning in the mid-60s, in these busing cases, began to legislate. They began to do the things that should be done by state legislatures or local school boards, deciding where, you know, how to divide the schools up, those kinds of matters. The court had said in '54, don't take race into account in the treatment of students. That should have ended the issue, but the court began to just invent law. That's where the problems have arisen, not just in the area of busing, everything from prison administration, you name it. Phyllis knows more of the details probably.
And Richard, to continue on that line of thinking and talking that Phyllis and Mac are doing right now, it's interesting that our founding fathers, as they looked at the three branches of government, that they viewed the judiciary as the one that we had to be aware of taking over too much power. For instance, Madison, who's the father of our Constitution, warned that this would be a danger unless it was curbed. And interestingly, we see that this did not happen overnight. Like nothing that's bad happens overnight. It's a continuation of things. De Tocqueville, for instance, the philosopher from France of the last century, came to this country, and he said that the aristocracy, the elitists that we had to be aware of in our country, was not the aristocracy, the elitists from the standpoint of people who had money, but from the standpoint of the judiciary and the bar. And so wise men in ages past have seen that if this thing of the courts got out of balance, that it could be destructive to our society. And of course, hopefully, as we talk today and and other places and give people information that they can understand, that there's something that can be done to correct the problem that's developed in our country.
I think the central problem is really lifetime tenure. Lifetime tenure that federal judges have. That has to be addressed perhaps before anything else.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things addressed in our book. That is a key issue.
I want to talk about those specific things, exactly what you think we ought to do in just a minute, all right? What I want you to do right now is get involved in this, all right? That 800 number is available to you wherever you live all across the country right now. If you've got a comment, maybe you think these people are totally off of their rocker, give me a call, all right? I'd love to hear from you. Or maybe you think they're absolutely angels from God that are sent as messengers to the entire globe. I'd love to hear from you also, okay? Or you could be in the middle there someplace, fair enough. But if you've got a question about the whole idea of judicial reform or an idea that you'd like to share with us, call that 800 number. I'd be happy to hear your opinion. So give me a buzz. Guys, let's talk what specifically, and we've got to take a break here in just a couple minutes to let our stations identify themselves, but let's talk about specifically what could be done. Okay.
All right, I'd like to pick up on what Mr. McGuigan said about the source of the problem being their lifetime tenure. I think, like Samson's hair, that's the source of their power. And you look, for example, President Roosevelt appointed William Douglas as a young man to the court, and he was on, Roosevelt had 4 terms, but Douglas was on for 36 years. He lasted through the presidencies of Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Nixon, Kennedy, Ford, and he went on Johnson, and he handed down all these decisions, which were very left-wing, and he continued to do it. Now, he stood up 4 times and promised to love a woman for better or for worse till death us do part, and he was able to get out of those. But here we were locked with him almost till death do us part.
We were married to him till death do us part.
And there he was, and he had his anti-religious bias, his left-wing bias throughout 36 years.
Do you think then the judges ought to come up for review? Do you think there ought to be a congressional review? Or
well, I think we ought to have hearings, and personally, I'd be in favor of having them stand for election. Now, most
a nationwide election, is that what we're talking about?
Nationwide for the Supreme Court, within the district for the district courts.
Could have an amendment to the Constitution to bring that about, because as we've run into problems before, we've had amendments to the Constitution. That'd be a good idea, in as much as we've seen this problem develop, very frankly, to have an amendment saying that they had, instead of lifetime tenure, that they had to run like a congressman or a senator or a president for that office that they're going to
Most states do that. You know, there's nothing so radical about that. Most states do that.
Our judges have to run, even here in the district. I don't know if the Supreme Court of Oklahoma, if they have to run or not.
Well, they do in our state.
Do they have to? Yeah, they do have to?
No. They sure do in our state.
Pat, let me ask you this. Of all the various things that are being talked about of ways to reform judiciary, what is the one that's really at the forefront right now? What seems to be the most popular idea?
Well, I'll make a distinction between the Congress and the people for just a second. In the Congress, the idea that probably has the best prospects within the next few months deals with withdrawal of jurisdiction on busing. This is very hot up on the Hill.
You mean just that one particular thing?
Yes.
So are they going to take it? Are they going to take it issue at a time? Is that what you're saying?
That's one approach.
You think that's
I
what's
would
going
say
to
with
happen?
the people, I want to just switch real quick and say that with the people, the most popular idea apparently is this idea of the people saying yes or no to a particular federal judge, like we do.
The whole
there in
idea of
Oklahoma.
election. Yeah,
right.
I hear you. I've got a break. We'll let our stations identify themselves across the country. We'll be back with your phones. So give us a call. Stay there. Welcome back. I'm glad you're with me. Phyllis Schlafly is with me today here in Oklahoma City, the outspoken one herself, all right? This lady is a lady who was so involved in stopping ERA when it got to Illinois, and it's almost been a dead issue since she started attacking it. In Washington, those two handsome gentlemen, Pat McGuigan, who wrote the book A Blueprint for Judicial Reform, and Ed McAteer, who's the president of the Roundtable, that distinguished-looking gentleman on the right. Ed, are you doing okay today?
Wonderful, Richard. Yeah.
Are you enjoying this?
I am. It's a much-needed thing, Richard. It's one of the big problems that we have in the country, and I always enjoy attacking a problem. And I have great confidence.
I've known that about you.
I have great confidence in the American people. I believe that when they are given the facts of what a problem is, and then given some direction that they have within themselves the ability to correct the problem. And I see this problem like a lot of others that we have today. It's a matter of getting information to the people. There's a mentality that people have that a judge is somehow removed from the sphere of the natural into the unnatural, and therefore that nothing can be done to correct the situation.
Yeah,
well,
Phyllis says they're not appointed, they think they're anointed.
That's right. Yeah, and it's a matter of legality as against morality, and so many people think anything that's legal is moral, and that isn't true.
Well, I think what's so important about Mr. McGuigan's book, A Blueprint for Judicial Reform, is that it shows that many scholars agree with the point of view that Mr. McAteer has been presenting, and it's starting a national debate on this issue of how the courts have abused their power.
You know, Phyllis, I think people want the judges, though, to be, you know, if the courts get in trouble, there's a feeling, I have this feeling a little bit, you know, if the courts are in trouble, it's almost the last folks at least you've got the courts. You know what I'm saying? I mean, for some reason, to me, I think about the, and you all may disagree, but anyway, I think about the politicians. Some reason I remove the courts from politicians.
Yes, but look at the political decisions that the courts have been making.
Yeah.
And if they've injected themselves into these controversies, which are outside of what they ought to be doing, then
obviously most people agree with you, according to
I would recommend, too, Phyllis can echo this probably, there's a very interesting book by Bob Woodward and Scott Armstrong, two Washington Post reporters. They're both liberals, but they wrote a book called The Brethren, about the Supreme Court, and it went inside, talked to law clerks and other individuals, and they discovered the political machinations that go into a typical Supreme Court decision.
Yeah.
Those Supreme Court justices they're fine individuals, but they are human beings.
Political animals, huh?
Their personal feelings enter into the decisions they make.
Yeah,
That's a political problem, and we have to address it in a practical, political way, and we can do that through ideas like those in this book. The book's only one set of ideas. I'm sure there are others. For instance, back home there, Senator Boren has an idea that every 10 years the Senate reconfirm federal judges rather than popular election. That's one worth looking at, I would think.
It is, and as we think, Richard, over the span of our history, we look back at the big problems we've had. We look, for instance, at slavery. That was a big problem. And we again repeat that the Supreme Court had its part in that problem because they decided that a black man was not a human being. In the day in which we're living, no question about it, the slaughter of preborn children is the biggest problem that we have in our country today. The Supreme Court has its part in that.
Yeah, that upsets me, Ed, that we never got to say a thing about that. You know, we never got to vote on that. No one's ever asked my opinion. I've never gotten to vote that we abort all these children. You've never gotten to vote for that. Yet the court is allowing it to happen and saying it must happen. That's the thing. It's sort of
well, the court has injected itself and decided all these sensitive issues. Now, take the matter of voluntary prayer in the schools.
Sure.
Prayers were said in the schools from the time of the founding of our country until 1962. In 1962, the Supreme Court discovered this new right that nobody else had seen, that everybody had to be prohibited from saying prayers in the schools.
Yeah.
And that's,
can I interject one thing? One of the chapters in our book, in a section dealing with religious freedom in the 80s, is by Dr. James McClellan, who works up on Capitol Hill with the Separation of Powers Subcommittee. And he does a really good job of bringing down to a practical level the real original meaning of the First Amendment. And of course, it doesn't mean anything even remotely similar to what the Supreme Court has interpreted it to mean in the last 20 years.
There's a question here.
What I'd like to know is what part the courts will play in the lives of the American people if the Equal Rights Amendment is added to the Constitution.
well, that's one of the big reasons why we don't want the Equal Rights Amendment. Section 2 gives tremendous power to the federal government, and there are all kinds of mischievous results that the ERA proponents are asking for. For example, I could cite you words and documents by ERA proponents who want ERA to require us to have child care centers for all children, universally available, regardless of need, who want ERA to authorize and require homosexual marriages, who want ERA to require a double Social Security tax on homemakers, who want ERA to give us federal wage control, and who want ERA to require us to pay tax funds for abortions. Now, I can't tell you positively that ERA will have all those bad effects.
But you think it will?
I can tell you positively that there will be massive litigation under
Phyllis,
ERA, and the courts will make the final decision. And we don't want to turn all over those decisions over to the federal court.
I think Phyllis is making a very important point here. If you look back, one of the determiners of what an amendment to the Constitution means is the intent of the framers. And you go back, Phyllis, you can talk all about this. You remember in 1972 when they passed the ERA, good man, Senator Sam Ervin, who's one of the contributors to our book, offered a number of amendments to make exceptions to the ERA for the very kind of areas that Phyllis has just mentioned, and the Senate turned down those amendments to the ERA. So if you look at the intent of the framers, the intent is to do the things Phyllis just discussed. That's what makes ERA so scary to those of us on the conservative end of the spectrum.
Right.
In the U.S. Sex Bias Code presented by the Civil Rights Commission, it deals with some laws that would have to be changed at this time if the Equal Rights Amendment were added. Could you comment on that?
Well, that is an official publication by the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, and what makes it so interesting is that it says in there that it was written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was probably the top pro-ERA lawyer and whom President Carter appointed to the second highest court in our land. Now, her views as to what the equality principle of ERA would require would really raise the hair off your head. Including such things as revising all our language. You couldn't say man-made, you'd have to change it to artificial, making the Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts co-ed and changing their name, eliminating the husband, breadwinner, wife, homemaker concept from our laws, and of course drafting women just like men, and also a massive interference with the laws on sex crimes.
Yes.
I've heard a lot of states across the country have state equal rights amendment, and I'm curious, are we having problems there already? The fact that
Yes, we are having a lot of problems in the areas of the rights of the wife. The wives have lost important traditional rights in those states. And then, of course, besides that, you know, the state ERAs are handled by the state court judges. And the federal ERA would be handled by the federal court judges, and we don't want to give the federal court judges more power because they're the ones who cause most of our problems.
I believe it's 16 states, isn't it, Phyllis?
No, it isn't. It's only 6, but anyway, whatever it is. Yes.
I doubt very much if that statement is true. The state ERAs have worked quite successfully. My question, though, is if the court system is as bad as we are painting it here, we certainly can't leave the equality of women up to such a system. It would be much simpler to pass the amendment and protect their rights and put them under the Constitution.
Fortunately, women are in the Constitution today, and you and I both have freedom of speech and press and religion and trial by jury and due process and every constitutional right.
The 14th Amendment used person. It didn't use male, female. It uses the term person.
Do you feel that she's out to lunch? You think this is all? You think she's wrong about this stuff?
I think the problem with the equal rights...
Just a minute, Pat.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Give me just a second here.
Go ahead, Phyllis.
I think some of these things can be stated in ways that make them sound rock-bound, and that's really not true. We don't know exactly. One thing that I think we can depend upon is that if the ERA is passed and accepted, one of the first things that happens will be that federal governments and state governments will have to reconsider all their laws because they are the main employer of women. They employ 20% of the women workers, and they underpay women.
They are
That's one of
subject
the
to
effects
the Equal
that we might
Employment Opportunity Act, Federal employees are subject to that law. We have the law that requires equal pay for equal work. The most immediate and first result of ERA would be that 19 and 20-year-old girls would have to register for the military draft just like 19 and 20-year-old men do today. And that is sure.
I've got to break. I'll be back. Stay there, please.
Slip away this January and celebrate the beginning of the new year in the most unique atmosphere ever created. Join over 900 other Christians for a sunshine cruise aboard the Italian luxury liner T.S. Flavia, sailing to the Bahamas with our special guest, the Imperials, Cynthia Clausen, Farrell and Farrell, Steve Camp, and the Joe English Band. Flavia's professional crew will cater to your every need with a fantastic array of international cuisine and superb, friendly service. Activities are planned so you have a choice of several things to do at any given time. Enjoy Christian concerts, Christian movies, Bible teachings, and intimate Christian fellowship under God's handmade canopy of stars. The Sunshine Cruise, 4 days and 4 nights aboard the T.S. Flavia with the Imperials. Cabins are going fast, so for a free brochure and information, call toll-free 1-800-331-3056. In Oklahoma, call 918-252-1567. Take the Sunshine Cruise, designed by Sunshine Concerts of Tulsa, Oklahoma.
I would like that a bit. Here's the book we've been talking about, A Blueprint for Judicial Reform. Now, if you would like to have this book, we can't give it to you free like we give the brochures, but if you would like to get this book, it is loaded, I promise you that. About 350 some odd pages, different men, 24 men and women wrote this book. It is super. If you'd like to get it, if you will write me, Richard Hogue, Box 3000, Oklahoma City, 73113, I will tell you how you can get the book. Or if you want to call 405-348-3000, we'll be happy to tell you what you need to do to receive this book, all right? It's good and you would enjoy getting it, I promise you that. Now guys, I'm going to go to the phone lines. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to give me your name, I want you to tell me where you're calling from, and I want you to state your question very quickly. Now please, don't use this as your soapbox to decide that you're going to preach to the world. Don't do that, all right? Instead, the name, your question, and then let us answer the question. Then if you want to come back and rebut that, that's fine. You got it? So let's play by those rules. And gentlemen and lady, let's try to keep our answers brief so we can get on as many calls as we possibly can. Hello, you're on the airline.
Yes, Stephanie Green from Jacksonville, Florida. My question is, as an average citizen, what can I do to help other than just writing letters to stand up for my rights?
Could I answer that, Richard?
Yes, Ed.
Yeah. First of all, do the same thing that we're doing here. Inform others what the problem is, and hopefully, through the information that you're receiving here today, tell them what the solution is. Send information to your congressmen and your senators concerning your view on this.
Ed, what do they say when they write their congressman? What do they say?
Withdraw jurisdiction. Do something about the courts.
That's good.
Cut back the abuse of power by the federal
courts. Vote on judges. What do you? I mean, there's not really one central thrust that you all are saying. You're just saying.
Well, there are lots of ideas. They ought to be able to hold hearings. They ought to go into it and do something to cut back the power of the federal courts.
Okay.
Yeah, that's well answered. Yeah,
okay.
That's good.
Thank you for your call. Bye-bye. Hello, you're on the airline.
Yes, I'd like to ask Mrs. Schlafly why she persists in frightening people by stating that Section 2 of the Equal Rights Amendment would take away states' rights, because it's already in 6 amendments to the U.S. Constitution and specifically provided for in Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 18 under the powers of Congress in the body of the Constitution.
Because we know from our experience with the 7 other amendments that have the same language that it did take away states' rights. We've had 100 years of experience with the same enforcement clause in these other amendments. We know that it has taken away massive areas of states' rights, particularly in the area of elections. The Voting Rights Act is a perfect example of that. Now, this country wanted to do it in the matter of elections, but we sure don't want to do it in the areas of marriage, divorce, child custody, adoptions, insurance laws, homosexual laws, prison laws, which would be under ERA.
Phyllis, give me some specific thing that you think would happen, like in marriage laws. Some specific, what are you talking about when you say?
A national, federal marriage law, divorce law.
Which would be like what? I mean, what would that mean?
Well, it could be anything. But you see, the great thing about this country has been the distribution of power between the federal government and the states and among the three branches.
I believe that the states would maintain their right to make marriage laws. They just could not make them on the presumption of sexist stereotypes.
Oh, but that's what Section 1 does. Section 1 would require your state law to be sex neutral, but Section 2 moves the power to the federal government. And the federal government can preempt the state law and say, even though you made it sex neutral, we don't happen to like it. We are substituting our federal judgment. Now, that is the holding of Katzenbach versus Morgan, which interpreted the same language in the 14th Amendment. And we don't want to do it.
What about that same language in the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote?
Well, fine, we're for that. Women vote in Mississippi.
In the Constitution.
They can't hear you guys when you're talking. There's a
well, so somebody in the audience who thinks women don't vote in Mississippi. Women do vote in Mississippi.
No, wait. Listen. If you're going to say something, grab the mic and say it, okay? It doesn't do any good to just speak out in the show, all right? So hand me the mic up there. Now, if you've got something you want to say, you're happy to say it.
Phyllis, in 1979, March, the state legislature tried to ratify the 19th Amendment, Mississippi. They did not pass it.
Women have voted in Mississippi since the 19th Amendment passed in 1920.
Because of the federal amendment, Phyllis.
That's right. So it's a non-issue. Women have voted in Mississippi.
That says that some states can't handle it, like Mississippi.
They don't need to. We have the 19th Amendment. It's a non-issue. Women vote in every state in this country. We all support that.
Hang in there,
I believe
Phyllis.
the gentleman's point is that if it were left up to the states, women in Mississippi and 3 other southern states that have voted and failed to ratify since the 19th Amendment has been implemented, that women in those states, if it were left up to the states' rights, would not have their
Well, all right, we've solved that problem. We want that to be a national rule, but that doesn't mean we want marriage and divorce to be a national rule.
It protects me from sex discriminatory laws.
Well, I want the way it is so that we can exempt all women from the draft.
I'm a homemaker, and I know that in states like Pennsylvania, where they've had a state equal rights amendment, almost exactly the same words as the federal amendment, that homemakers have benefited the most, and that mothers with young children who are divorced are less likely to be forced into the labor force.
Well, in the case in Pennsylvania of Albert Einstein Medical Center versus Nathan's, the court held that under the state ERA, a husband doesn't even have to pay for his wife's hospital bill. And that's an example of the rights that wives have lost in the state ERA states.
Was it not possible that she could have taken care of it too?
The law was made sex neutral rather than sex discriminatory, and in that particular case, the woman had funds to pay for her own medical bills.
We don't want it sex neutral. We want the law to say the husband must support his wife. That's why we don't want ERA.
2/3 of the people in this country disagree.
Okay, thank you, caller. Appreciate your call. Bye-bye.
Can I ask a question?
What were you about to say?
Just one, and that is, I realize what you're saying about the draft and the fact that you don't want women in the draft. Let me ask, would you, if the time came down to it, that we needed every able body to fight, we were in a war, would you?
We didn't even need that in World War II.
No, I'm just asking a question. Would you personally fight for our country, for me? Would you fight?
If it came to that. But even in World War II,
but otherwise you're going to let your son and your husband die? You're going to let us all die for you.
We have 16 million young men of draft age. There's no possible need that we could ever have for sending young women to fight.
Ed, do you and Pat want to say anything on this?
Yeah, I'll say that he's talking about a straw man. It's something that doesn't exist, and I agree totally with Phyllis that that women have a place, men have a place, and that women's places are not to be fighting and carrying on wars from time immemorial.
That's right. The men of this country are not going to send their wives and sweethearts and sisters out to do their fighting for them.
Hello, you're on the airline. Hello.
Yes, my name is Ann. I'm calling from Shreveport, Louisiana.
Yes, Ann.
And my question is, where is the power going to stop?
I don't understand.
What the problem we have today, I think, is that the courts have greatly extended their constitutional power. And I think it's time for Congress to cut that back, just as we have cut back other branches of the government when they got too powerful. And we have all the machinery in the Constitution, in Article 3, to do that. And if we want to do it even more than we can do it in Article 3, we can pass a constitutional amendment to make the judges stand for re-election.
And that's important because as we understand the formation of our country, we see that the whole basis upon which our country was established was self-government. The old oligarchy of Europe, people didn't have that opportunity. And the summation really of all that we've been talking about today again is that we have three branches of our government: a legislative, a judicial, and an executive branch. And the problem that we're having today that's really out of hands of the people is the judicial branch. It can be brought back in if we understand what the problem is and how to address it.
Caller, I've just got a few seconds left. Is that what you were trying to say? What are you concerned about the power stopping? I don't know that I understand what you're saying.
Well, mine is that I live in Caddo Parish, and 4 years ago, the judicial system said that we were the segregated parish, in the schools, in the public schools. Now they've come back in again and reversed what they said originally, and now there's a whole new set of circumstances, and there's going to be crosstown busing and all these things when they had said we were integrated, and I'm not against integration.
Does that upset you that the court's acting like that?
Yes.
Do you feel like
the one that's doing it?
Do you feel like you should be able to vote on those things?
Yes, I do.
Do you feel like you should be able to vote for that judge to see if he stays in power?
Yes, I do.
And I don't think he'd decide that way if he had to be voted on.
That's probably the issue right
Right,
there. Yeah.
it sure
That's
is.
the issue.
We've got a break. I'll be back in just a minute. Stay there, please.
Make a date for this date at the Lloyd Noble Center. December 4th. Enjoy an evening of praise and song with B.J. Thomas.
I've been walking on a cloud.
Advance tickets and mail order requests for B.J. Thomas to the Lloyd Noble Box Office, 2900 Jenkins, Norman, 73019. Or call 405-325-3838. B.J. Thomas in concert December 4th, Lloyd Noble Center.
Each day, our live studio audience is made up of people from across the state, as well as travelers from other parts of the country. Make it a point soon for you, your group, class, or organization to meet Richard and be in his audience at Studio 25 here in Oklahoma City. For more information, write or call today.
I got to this, and this is what I need to know.
Well, they were not in the debater now.
Phyllis is going to do something for us, which I want you to know about, all right? She said that if you will write me, she will give me several copies of this report on the judiciary, and I'll be happy to send these out to you totally and absolutely free. Would you do that, all right? So if you'll write me, Richard Hogue, Box 3000, Oklahoma City, 73113, and say, I would like Phyllis's report on the judiciary, I'll get it in the mail to you. Or you could call right now. I've got a lot of friends who are standing by to take your call, 405-348-3000, and say, I would like the report on the judiciary, or the Phyllis Schlafly report, okay, and I'll get it to you, and I promise you it will help. I read tons and tons of stuff to get ready for today. When I got all through, I read this, and I said, God, I wish I'd have read this first. It would save me a lot of time, all right? So would you do that, okay? If you want the thing, write me, Box 3000, Oak City, or call 405-348-3000 and say, I want Phyllis's report on the judiciary. We'll get it right in the mail to you, and I promise you it will help. Let me say real fast, Ed, you don't have much time because I want a man to be able to say something here in a minute. Thank you for being with me. You're wonderful as usual. Pat, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Phyllis, thank you. And my friend, what did you want to say?
Just a brief comment that actually all of our rights come from God, and God's laws supersede any law that man ever has or ever will write. And no time in the Bible did God ever send a woman into military service.
Well, sometimes they mention Joan of Arc, but you notice she didn't have any men in her troops.
Was that a whole? We better not get into that. That's going to be a totally different thing, isn't it? McAteer.
Yes.
I'm glad you're with me. Listen, I'm looking forward to next week. We're going to be in in Houston, Texas together. Very, very important time, right?
Right.
And,
Richard, and these shows are just, programs I think are just real exciting. We're having so many good comments, and we feel that the purpose of the programs are being accomplished. That is, educating a wonderful group of people in this country called an American citizen.
Let me say one last thing. Phyllis, I wanted you to talk to this. Again, you've only got about 45 seconds, but if a person's upset, they want to do something, tell them, what do we do?
Well, first of all, I should have said she didn't have any women in her troops when I mentioned Joan of Arc. But anyway, what can they do? Well, with my newsletter, they have a few facts to proceed, and I think they ought to tell their senators and congressmen that they want them to withdraw jurisdiction from the federal courts, that they want them to examine a constitutional amendment which would allow us to vote on federal judges, and want them to explore this whole issue.
And I guess the most important thing is just get involved, whichever side of the issue they're on. The debate is going to do us good, if nothing else, if we talk about these things and begin to bring people's attention to what's happening. Pat, thank you for being with me.
Thank you, Richard.
You old Okie, you're looking good. And Ed, I'll see you next week. And Phyllis, thank you. And thank you for joining me tomorrow. You're getting the whole idea of China, what's happening behind the Great Wall. So be sure you're with me, and I'll see you then. Bye-bye.